Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Boston. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1898, late November, and the gates of the modest convent on the outskirts of Dorchester were wrapped in a crawling fog. The autumn air carried a chill that settled deep in the bones of the small community of sisters, novices and lay helpers who labored in silence inside the stone cloisters of St. Brigid's Convent. The convent stood some miles from the center of Boston, its grounds bordered by a neglected cemetery and an overgrown access road. Sister Erheba arrived quietly at dusk, summoned by the Mother Superior for reasons never fully recorded. The ledger simply reads, Sister Erheba transferred to Dorchester, 21 Nov 98. The city around them was undergoing change, rails and factories humming, waves of immigrants arriving, Catholic institutions expanding under the auspices of the Archdiocese of Boston, even as old suspicions lingered. The riots at the Ursuline Convent decades earlier had left deep scars in local memory. Within hours of her arrival, the first oddities appeared: a lantern left in the chapel corridor after curfew, shadows in the cemetery that didn't align with the moon, footsteps in the gravel when no one should have been moving. Sister Erheba's face, in the earliest statements, was described as pallid and rigid. A local lay helper, Martha Callahan, later recalled, "Her eyes did not meet mine as I passed her in the hall. Something in them seemed fixed beyond the prayer book." Records show she requested midnight vigils more frequently than the order generally allowed, and she seemed restless during the day's work. The cemetery gates creaked when no wind stirred them. The sisters heard whispers in the chapel after midnight, though no one confessed to staying awake. All this formed the first tremors of what would become a deeply unsettling case file, one that would strain the boundaries of faith, fear, and reason. We will now turn to the background of the property and the sisters themselves. The land on which St. Brigid's Convent stood had once belonged to the Garrison family, early merchants whose fortune dissolved after the Panic of 1873. Their farmhouse was razed, and in 1881, the Archdiocese purchased the lot for quiet retreat and female instruction. Yet locals claimed the soil itself was ill-favored. Parish minutes mention workers refusing to dig foundations after uncovering human remains, not listed in any parish burial ledger. A single sentence survives in the carpenter's notebook: 2 skulls, adult size, unearthed under east wall, reinterred without ceremony. The convent's official architect dismissed it as rumor, but the masons refused to work after sunset. By the time Sister Erheba arrived, much of that oral history had faded into local gossip, told by children to frighten one another. The convent itself was self-sustaining: vegetable gardens, a laundry, and a small infirmary. Its chapel bell, cast in 1882, was said to echo differently on damp nights, a flat tone that some described as like a swallowed cry. Parish correspondence reveals that Boston's clerical circle regarded St. Brigid's as peripheral, too small to draw attention except during Lent collections. Within the convent walls, Sister Erheba was known for her silence. Mother Ignatia's diary, discovered decades later among diocesan papers, records, "She moves as one listening to something behind the walls." Another note from March 1899 reads simply, "Whispers again near the crypt stairs." No source found. That stairwell connecting the chapel to the burial vault below had been sealed since 1891 after flooding damaged the lower chamber. When Erheba arrived, she petitioned for permission to help restore it for purposes of contemplation. Her request was denied, yet witnesses later swore they heard the sound of chiseling after Compline. The watchman, a widower named Thomas Reed, reported seeing a lantern glow under the chapel floor one night around Christmas. He left a statement with the parish constable, but was found dead 3 weeks later of pneumonia, though the coroner noted soil under fingernails inconsistent with confinement indoors. Around this time, the convent's correspondence ceased for nearly 6 months. Letters to the Archdiocese went unanswered, and the delivery boy, Patrick Holt, later testified that envelopes were left uncollected, as if no one lived there. Newspapers mention only a small note: local convent closed to visitors for Lent retreat. But in fragments of later affidavits, one phrase appears repeatedly: the sister in the crypt, even now, Researchers comparing these events with older accounts of anti-Catholic agitation, like those following the Ursuline Convent riots, notice a haunting continuity, not of violence this time but of silence. And it is within that silence that Sister Eahiba's name first began to blur between record and rumor. When the convent finally reopened its doors in midsummer 1899, Boston's parish inspectors noted a peculiar odor of earth and incense lingering in the halls. Sister Eahiba was said to have fallen ill during the retreat and was confined to her cell. Yet no physician's note exists. The infirmarian, Sister Margaret Lynn, later gave a deposition stating that she had tended to a malady of exhaustion and cold sweats, worsened by confinement and fasting. A week later, Eahiba vanished. Her name was quietly struck from the convent register, the margin annotated with the phrase transferred without detail. Rumors soon spread among the market vendors who supplied the convent. One, a carter named Lowell Finn, told a reporter that the sisters were digging again near the back fence at dusk. Another man swore he'd heard faint hymns coming from the cemetery when the chapel bell was silent. At the time, the police dismissed such talk as common superstition. Boston was modernizing, and the constables preferred crimes they could measure. Still, a visiting priest, Father Henri Dubois, wrote privately to the archdiocese that some presence is troubling the order at St. Brigid's, and their demeanor recalls the terrors following the Ursuline tragedy of old. In September, a storm toppled the outer fence, exposing part of the cemetery grounds. Beneath the roots of a dead elm, workers found fragments of cloth consistent with a nun's habit and a rosary whose beads were cracked by pressure. The find was reburied under ecclesiastical supervision. But City Archivist George T. Winters later remarked in a note, "The bones appeared not wholly ancient." That note survives only because Winters' file on the convent was mislabeled and thus escaped a 1911 records purge. Through the autumn, nearby parishioners reported a solitary candle seen in the chapel after midnight. One constable dispatched to investigate claimed he found the chapel doors locked from inside, though every key was accounted for. A month later, he resigned, citing nervous complaint. The following winter, the new Mother Superior ordered all portraits of Sister Eahiba removed, saying they invited unnecessary curiosity. Historians have long debated whether Eahiba was transferred, dismissed, or entombed without record. A 1904 diocesan memorandum mentions one unsound novice removed for reasons of health and decorum, which some link to her case. Others note that a woman matching her description was seen years later in Providence, living under the name Mrs. Edith Bain. Yet the handwriting in a hotel ledger from that city bears an uncanny resemblance to Eahiba's entries in the convent ledger, the same narrow slant, the same overlooped E. Whatever the truth, those who examined the convent grounds afterward agreed on one thing: the air near the crypt never lost its damp, earthen scent, as if something beneath still waited for acknowledgement. By 1900, whispers of the resurrected sister had drifted beyond Dorchester. The phrase first appeared in a private circular distributed among parish rectors, warning against unverified tales of bodily return. The note was unsigned, but clearly intended to contain a spreading rumor that Sister Eahiba had been seen walking the convent garden weeks after her recorded death. Mother Ignatia denied this in writing, insisting the sighting was a delusion born of nerves. Still, several townsfolk claimed to have glimpsed a veiled figure moving between the trees near midnight. One of them, a milkman named Alton Gray, filed a short affidavit in April 1900. "I saw the sister pass the gate and turn toward the cemetery path. She made no sound, and when I reached the corner, she was gone." When questioned, Gray described her expression as alert, as though searching for someone. The authorities dismissed it, noting his long work hours and fondness for rum. Yet that same week, a group of children discovered a small cross pinned into the bark of an elm near the fence. On the back, in faint engraving, were the letters E.B. Parish Clerk Francis Lowe photographed it before handing it to the rectory. The cross later disappeared from the diocesan archive, its entry line marked simply mislaid. At this point, references to earlier unrest, like the old Ursuline Convent riots of 1834, began resurfacing in newspapers, drawing parallels between the two sites. One destroyed by fire, the other now haunted by neglect and whispers. An editorial in the Boston Courier observed, "Perhaps the divine keeps its ledger open longer than we do." It drew no official response, but privately Father Dubois warned that the Church's handling of St. Brigid's may invite superstition where silence once served. That silence broke in late autumn when a visiting surveyor, John Halberg, reported finding a partially collapsed subcellar beneath the convent chapel, an area absent from the building plans. His notes describe old timber beams and a narrow recess leading toward the cemetery wall. Inside lay fragments of glass and a rusted lamp. He delivered the findings to the county registry, and within a week the convent was closed for structural repairs. Halberg died of pneumonia the following winter, leaving only his notebook, now preserved in the Suffolk County collection. The convent never reopened. By 1902, the grounds were sold to a charitable hospital, which soon encountered its own misfortunes: faulty wiring, fires, and inexplicable drafts that extinguished corridor lamps. Patients reported hearing soft chanting through the vents. The attending sisters attributed it to echoing pipes, yet the engineers could never reproduce the sound. To this day, the hospital chaplain keeps a small crucifix carved from the elm where the cross was found. He refuses to let it leave the chapel. "It belongs here," he once told an interviewer, "where she last stood." And though no one says her name aloud, the air still holds that same faint trace of earth and incense. The sale records of the convent site list its new owner as the Boston Mercy Infirmary Trust, a small charitable institution headed by Dr. Ezra, Monsieur Coulson. Coulson's surviving correspondence reveals his growing unease about the property he had acquired. In one letter to his brother, he wrote, "The nurses complain of the church tower bells that ring at ungodly hours, though the ropes have long been cut. A few of the staff were former pupils from the same convent school. They avoided the basement entirely, saying they heard the tread of skirts on stone." The infirmary's matron, Mrs. Keene, noted in her nightly reports that the east wing's lamps dimmed whenever the chapel door was opened. She called it poor wiring, though the electrician found the circuit untouched. In early 1903, Coulson invited a cleric from Providence to re-bless the property. Father Henry Dubois, the same priest who had earlier investigated the convent, performed the ceremony quietly, sprinkling holy water across the altar steps. His private journal, later found in the rectory attic, recorded a single line beneath that date: "The air beneath the nave remains restless." Dubois also mentioned revisiting older diocesan files, including reports of the Ursuline convent riots decades prior, suggesting that Boston's soil still carried memories unwilling to fade. By midsummer, the infirmary had developed a reputation. Patients swore they heard humming from the cellar. One child described a woman kneeling in the hallway praying without sound. Coulson, a practical man, dismissed this as delirium from laudanum doses. Yet he kept the staff registry locked after one nurse resigned suddenly, leaving only the note, "I cannot abide the singing below." When he inspected the basement himself, he discovered a recess sealed by stone and plaster. Behind it lay fragments of wood, cloth, and a tarnished crucifix. His assistant recorded the discovery in the maintenance log, but was instructed not to speak of it publicly. By the winter of 1904, Boston newspapers reported that the Mercy Infirmary had suspended admissions due to repairs. In truth, funding had faltered, and rumors had eroded the trust's credibility. The building stood vacant for nearly a decade. Locals remembered it as the place where the sister walked twice. During those years, trespassers occasionally entered the grounds. One vagrant was found asleep near the chapel steps, muttering in Latin phrases later identified as fragments of an old psalm. When the property finally changed hands again, the buyer, a textile manufacturer, demolished most of the remaining structures. Only the church facade and cemetery remained untouched, fenced and overgrown. Even now, when historians trace Boston's lesser-known ecclesiastical histories, St. Brigid's appears as a footnote beside the better-documented Ursuline disaster, a quieter tragedy with no fire, no mob, only the steady vanishing of people and records until nothing but the smell of damp stone remains. By 1908, the old convent site had faded from public notice. The remaining church facade, blackened by weather, loomed over a patch of neglected grass and leaning stones. The manufacturing company that had bought the land kept its warehouses a full block away, leaving the church grounds as buffer space. Night guards avoided the area. In the Boston city directories, the entry St. Bridget's former carried the note "Structure unstable, entry prohibited." Yet it became an unspoken destination for those drawn to lost causes, seminarians seeking quiet, or men returning from the harbor taverns who claimed they heard bells tolling underground. In 1910, a local historian named Clara Whitcomb began assembling material for a monograph on Boston's religious architecture. She gained permission to photograph the remains. Her surviving plate negatives show the doorway half collapsed, ivy woven through the stone lattice. In her field diary, she described an impression of presence, like someone moving behind the lens. 2 months later, she abandoned the project and took a teaching post in Salem. Among her notes was a marginal line, the same tone of silence as described in the Ursuline accounts, emptiness that answers back. City maintenance crews occasionally fenced the cemetery, but never fully cleared it. One worker reported finding a woman's shoe preserved in the mud near the crypt wall, of church make, single strap, no buckle. The find went unclaimed. A reporter from the Evening Transcript revisited the site in 1912, calling it a minor ruin bearing the weight of whispered sin. His article, though brief, reignited local talk of Sister Eohiba. Parish elders condemned the speculation, insisting no records tied her to wrongdoing. Still, the name returned to folklore, spoken quietly in tenements and workshops. The last official inspection of the grounds came in 1916 after a lightning strike damaged the tower cross. The report mentions a small recess discovered near foundation, filled with compacted earth and one iron lantern. The lantern, when cleaned, bore engraving on its base. E.B. The object was sent to diocesan storage but was lost during a later relocation. Within that same year, the old church was finally demolished, its stones repurposed for a seawall project along Dorchester Bay. Yet demolition did not end the stories. Workers claimed the air around the carted rubble smelled of cold incense. A superintendent wrote in his journal, "Some nights, when the tide is low, the wind through the arches sounds like distant chanting." When historians close the file on St. Bridget's, they always return to that line. The church is gone, its registry erased, but the sense of something incomplete, something waiting beneath the soil of Boston, persists, quiet as the tide. After the demolition, the site lay vacant for years, a patch of broken ground behind new warehouses. City workers called it the Hollow. A survey from 1919 lists the parcel simply as unfit for construction due to subsoil instability. Still, men who worked the night shift swore the earth there trembled faintly when trains passed, though no tracks ran close enough to explain it. The superintendent filed several complaints about trespassers seen wandering near midnight. They left no prints in the morning frost. When asked who might bother with an empty lot, he answered, "Those looking for a story to tell." In the archives of Suffolk County, a folded letter survives without envelope or signature. It's dated January 1920 and written in a careful, looping hand. She is not gone. They took the walls but not the room beneath. The ink had bled, but the words are legible enough to feed speculation that the subcellar remained sealed under the fill. Engineers deny it. The blueprints show full excavation, but no one can prove either side without digging, and no one is willing to try. That same year, a teacher named Clara Whitcomb, by then nearly 60, gave a lecture at the Historical Society on women's institutions of faith in 19th century Boston. She mentioned St. Bridget's only once, saying, "Some ruins resist the calendar. They continue to keep watch." In her notes, she cross-referenced her old study of the Ursuline Convent riots, reminding listeners that fear and reverence often grow from the same soil. The audience transcript records nervous laughter, then silence. By the mid-1920s, the Hollow had become a dumping ground for factory refuse. Children were warned away, yet local boys dared one another to cross it at dusk. One, Thomas Riley, told a parish interviewer decades later that he and his friends once saw a lady in a black veil kneeling by the fence, like she was praying into the dirt. They fled, leaving their lanterns behind. When they returned the next day, they found the ground freshly turned where she had knelt, though rain had not fallen that week. The city paved over the lot in 1928 to extend the delivery road to the docks. Beneath the asphalt workmen reported a persistent hollow sound when striking the base layer. The foreman described it as a drum under the stone. They poured extra concrete to fill the space, muttering about old graves. No one kept a record of what exactly they sealed that day. The supervisor, interviewed years later, said only, "The sound stopped after that." And so the map of Boston changed, swallowing the last trace of St. Bridget's. Yet some who walk that stretch of road at night still pause, claiming the air tastes faintly of salt and candle smoke. No proof, only sensation, like memory trapped beneath the pavement, waiting for the right silence to rise again. By 1931, the area once known as the Hollow had merged seamlessly into the industrial sprawl of Dorchester Bay. Few remembered that a convent had ever stood there. Yet that winter, a municipal worker named Harold Crane filed a brief report noting unexplained subsidence near Pier Street, possible void beneath pavement. The matter was forwarded to the Engineering Bureau and quietly shelved. But what drew later attention was a penciled addendum found on the same sheet. Heard what I thought was singing. The handwriting, according to archivists, was not Crane's. Around this period, Boston newspapers ran human interest pieces on the city's forgotten ruins, including a paragraph about St. Bridget's. The evening transcript recalled how the convent bells once tolled for a sister who did not die. Readers dismissed it as literary flair. Yet one elderly woman sent a letter to the editor, insisting she had been a novice there when the walls still stood. Her name was withheld, but the editor's reply thanked Miss E. Bain of Providence for her memory. The initial E.B. rekindled speculation about Sister Erheba, and for a brief moment, the legend flared again before fading into the noise of the Depression years. In 1934, during coastal reinforcement work, laborers unearthed a section of stone arch, half buried in sand. The foreman ordered it removed, thinking it remnant masonry, but one of the men, a Polish immigrant named Stefan Nowak, kept a small fragment as a souvenir. Decades later, his granddaughter donated it to the Boston Historical Society. When tested, the stone matched limestone quarried near Milton, the same material listed in diocesan accounts for the convent's construction. On its surface were faint scratches forming a cross and a single letter E. Among private collectors, tales of that fragment circulated as though it carried the convent's residue. A few even claimed it gave off the scent of incense when warmed by sunlight, though no chemical explanation surfaced. Still, serious historians like Whitcomb and Winters, whose successors preserved their correspondence, treated these stories as the natural persistence of folklore. Both observed that Boston, still shadowed by memories of the Ursuline convent riots, had cultivated a special sensitivity to religious unease. "We are a city that keeps its ghosts tidy," Winters once wrote. "We file them, label them, and pretend they obey the drawers we place them in." By the close of the decade, the Hollow was forgotten again, paved, mapped, taxed. But those who worked the night patrol along Pier Street spoke of a dim figure crossing the far end of the lot, vanishing before the next lamp. They called her simply the Sister. Whether it was trick of fog or memory, none could say. What remains certain is that each witness described her as turning toward the harbor. As though still listening for a sound, the city long ago decided to stop hearing. During the 1940s, with the war demanding steel and concrete, much of Boston's older infrastructure was repurposed. The Pier Street stretch, once the convent's resting ground, was chosen for a naval storage yard. Engineers reported no structural issues, yet several draftsmen noted the difficulty of getting stable compass readings near the center of the lot. They attributed it to iron deposits, but one inspector recorded privately, "The instruments behave as if something below pulls differently." Such lines never reached the official file, but surfaced decades later in municipal archives. One evening in 1943, a watchman named Gerald Prentice wrote to his wife describing a strange occurrence. "Just after midnight, the tide was out, yet I heard water beneath the ground like it was moving through stone. The next day he fell from a scaffold and was hospitalized. His recovery room notes mention he refused to sleep with the lights off. A colleague who relieved him that night later claimed he saw a woman in a long dark dress standing by the fence. Not solid," he told a city investigator, "but not a shadow either. She was looking toward the bay." The investigator dismissed it as exhaustion, though the man insisted until his death that she left footprints in the frost. By 1947, the site had been renamed Pier Street Depot No. 3. Its maintenance logs include routine entries, flooding, rats, stolen cables, and one peculiar line: employee refuses to enter sub-storage vault, states prayers below. The depot foreman's margin note reads simply, "Dismissed." Local rumor turned the vault into a forbidden place, and the workers began leaving offerings of cigarettes or coins near its locked hatch. They said it kept the machinery running smoother. Scholars looking back on this period cite the persistence of ritual behavior among laborers as evidence of folk continuity, echoing older Catholic habits. They draw parallels to the renewed interest in the Ursuline convent history that circulated in newspapers during Boston's tercentenary celebrations. In that climate, it was easy for forgotten names, Eahiba, Ignatia, Brigid, to slip back into public talk, though always blurred by time. When the Navy abandoned the depot in 1951, city planners proposed converting the area into a commercial pier. During clearance, a backhoe struck what was thought to be an old drainage tunnel. Work halted for inspection, but no records describe what the engineers found. The hole was refilled within a week and concreted over. A clerk later noted the sudden decision came from above, with no signature attached. That same year, a local priest blessing the dockyards wrote in his homily, "There are parts of this city where prayer once whispered refuses to be unheard." He did not mention the location, but those present recalled he faced Pier Street as he spoke. And afterward, when fog rolled in from the harbour, the bells of St. Mary's 3 blocks away rang once, though no hand touched their ropes. By the late 1950s, Pier Street had become an unremarkable industrial strip, its earlier layers of history buried beneath asphalt and bureaucracy. Yet the oddities persisted in paperwork. The Department of Public Works received repeated complaints from dockhands about muffled ringing during night shifts. Maintenance crews traced the sound to nowhere. Seismographs showed no vibration. An engineer named Robert Fallon filed a private memorandum. "The noise resonates as if under pressure, like air trapped beneath stone." His superior annotated in red, "Not technical, delete." Fallon resigned 2 months later and moved inland. Old residents of Dorchester, meanwhile, still told stories about the convent, though most were second-hand. In a 1958 oral history interview, an aged former nurse recalled the Mercy Infirmary years. The hallway smelled of candles even when no mass was said. Asked if she ever knew Sister Eahiba, she hesitated before replying, "We were told never to speak her name." The archivist who recorded her testimony added in brackets, "Speaker's eyes teared, the room was cold." That same year, an urban renewal survey photographed the area before modernization. In one exposure, the film captured what appears to be a faint female silhouette near the old boundary fence, a blur the size of a standing figure. Analysts attribute it to double exposure, yet the camera log lists no such error. The negative was misfiled under miscellaneous industrial subjects until rediscovered decades later. When historians enlarged it, the outline seemed to turn slightly toward the camera, as though aware of being observed. Local clergy revisited these accounts during a conference on Boston's ecclesiastical heritage. Father Laurent, who chaired the session, drew comparisons to the Ursuline convent legacy, noting that cities built on unrested ground often inherit its language. He cited parish records showing that St. Brigid's dedication mass had used the same hymn sung at the Ursuline chapel before the riots, a coincidence that unsettled even the most rational scholars. "We inherit more than buildings," he concluded. "We inherit the silences that built them." By 1961, new warehouses covered the pier. Workers poured concrete footings directly over the suspected crypt area. They reported that the first batch failed to set properly. It remained damp for days, as if the ground exhaled moisture. The second pour hardened without issue. When inspectors returned weeks later, the surface bore faint circular stains, darker than cement, roughly where the old chapel once stood. They scrubbed the marks, but within hours they reappeared, lighter as though printed from beneath. Those stains are gone now, erased by resurfacing, but one photograph in the municipal record still shows them, 5 irregular circles forming the shape of a cross. Archivists label it chemical reaction, 1961, but on the back of the print in pencil, someone wrote Same pattern as bell rope burns. The handwriting has never been identified. As the 1960s progressed, Pier Street's industrial character began to fade, replaced by storage depots and trucking lanes. The last direct memory of St. Brigid's seemed extinguished, until a local journalist, Ellen Graves, started a column on Boston's buried histories. In March 1965, she published a short piece titled "The Sister Who Stayed." Drawing from scattered diocesan ledgers and municipal notes, she reconstructed a brief timeline of the convent's collapse, ending with the question, if the earth beneath Pier Street could speak, what hymns would it still remember? The article sparked mild public interest. Letters arrived from elderly parishioners who recalled their grandparents' warnings never to walk that route at night. One reader enclosed a faded photograph of a rosary, claiming it had been unearthed during post-war roadwork. The beads were cracked and darkened. The crucifix, engraved EB experts at the Historical Society, confirmed it was of late 19th century manufacture, consistent with local convents. Graves requested to see the object, but the sender never replied again. She continued her research, citing the old Ursuline convent riots as a cultural wound that never quite healed, linking Boston's unease with its buried institutions. Her editor found the connection too scholarly for features and cut half her notes, but she kept investigating privately. In her field notebook, now archived, one page reads, "Visited Pier Street, air heavy, metallic. Heard faint rhythm like chanting or distant machinery. Stood still. Sound stopped." The following week she fell ill with pneumonia. Co-workers joked darkly about the Brigid curse. Around that same time, a redevelopment survey photographed the pier warehouses for zoning approval. One image, taken from an elevated crane, showed a pale discoloration near the ground, an elongated shadow out of line with every visible object. Technicians dismissed it as film damage, but Graves included a cropped version in a later lecture, calling it the last known image of the St. Brigid's trace. Her audience described the picture as ordinary, until she pointed out that the shadow aligned precisely with where the chapel door once stood. Graves died in 1968, leaving her notes to a friend in the city archives. Among them was an unfinished essay with a haunting final line, "Boston forgets by building upward, but the ground never forgets what it holds." Modern historians often quote that sentence when discussing how local folklore preserves the shape of vanished places. It is also the last known written reference to Sister Erheba until the digital records era began, when her name resurfaced quietly in scanned ledgers, blurred but legible, as though reappearing through the paper itself. The arrival of the 1970s brought urban renewal once more. Pier Street storage blocks were cleared for a modern shipping terminal, and heavy machinery clawed deep into the ground that had once been the convent's cellar. Contractors uncovered layers of brick and limestone, some blackened, others pristine. Joe Foreman noted, sections of wall unlike any listed in prior schematics. The discovery caused a brief halt in construction while the city archaeologist, Dr. Matthew Klein, examined the site. His official report, thin, 2 pages, mentions only fragments of ecclesiastical masonry, late 19th century. Yet his private journal, released after his death, adds low vault beneath fill, smell of wax and decay. Lantern fragments again. Klein's journal cross-references old diocesan transfers, comparing them to St. Brigid's timeline and to the Ursuline ruins decades earlier. He observed that both institutions had vanished without leaving full burial lists. "There are prayers here with no names attached," he wrote. The vault was resealed, its position recorded only in margin sketches. When construction resumed, the new terminal poured foundations directly above it. In 1974, a cargo worker named Peter Malloy began reporting strange condensation forming inside sealed containers near the center of the dockyard. He described it as cold mist, though the air outside was dry. Maintenance logs confirm repeated humidity checks, but no source. 2 months later, Malloy was found drowned in shallow runoff near the retaining wall. His colleagues told investigators he'd been drinking, though his shift captain insisted he was sober. He said he saw a woman by the floodlights before he fell, the captain recalled. But the cameras caught nothing. That same year, a Jesuit historian researching the Ursuline riots revisited St. Brigid's records. In his essay for the Catholic Review, Father Paul de Rosier mentioned the resonance of silence shared between the two sites, suggesting that Boston's religious memory circulates like air trapped beneath its stones. It was the first scholarly acknowledgement of St. Brigid's in decades. Des Rosiers quoted an unnamed dock worker who claimed he felt a pulse under the ground near midnight, as if the harbour itself were breathing. By 1979, modernization had buried the vault entirely under reinforced concrete. The project files note that subsidence persisted even after reinforcement, minor unexplainable shifts in soil density. Engineers called it harbour seepage. Yet the final inspection report contains a single penciled line beside the map coordinates of the original chapel. Audible resonance, low, rhythmic, uncertain source. The handwriting matches Dr. Klein's, though he had retired 2 years earlier. Afterward, locals noticed that the pier lights nearest that section flickered every night precisely at 12:03 a.m. Electricians rewired the grid repeatedly, to no avail. Eventually, they stopped trying. Old systems hum, one technician shrugged, but older dockhands still refer to that patch as the Sisters' Watch, and even today they keep a small crucifix nailed to the wall of the electrical shed, polished smooth by years of cautious hands. By the early 1980s, Pier Street Terminal stood as a quiet piece of modern infrastructure, rows of stacked cargo, sodium lights, and the steady drone of engines. No one thought of the convent anymore, except for a handful of older dock workers who whispered about the Sisters' Watch. They claimed that during fog, one could hear the faint toll of a bell from beneath the concrete. The management dismissed it as vibration from mooring chains, though no other pier carried the same note. A security officer, Daniel Hoyt, logged a single entry on April 12, 1982. Heard low ringing under pier decking. Not mechanical. Lasted about 15 seconds. The note was initialed but never followed up. That same year, local historian Evelyn Carter published an article in the Bostonian Review titled "Forgotten Sisters, the Convent Below Pier Street." She cited Father Des Rosiers' earlier essay and included Klein's unpublished field sketches, drawing renewed interest from academics. Carter visited the site with permission from the Harbour Authority. In her diary, she wrote, "Standing over the coordinates of the chapel, I felt a slow vibration through the soles of my shoes, not tremor, but breathing." Her students thought she exaggerated, yet one accompanying photographer later reported that every frame he took at that spot came out with a faint vertical blur, as if the film were moving inside the camera. The equipment tested fine afterward. Carter compared the event to old legends surrounding the Ursuline grounds, sites where silence persisted even after total erasure. Boston, she wrote, was built on devotion and dissent, both of which leave echoes. She concluded that St. Brigid's represented the city's impulse to bury unease rather than confront it. When she died in 1985, her papers were donated to the University of Massachusetts Archive. Among them was an envelope marked "For Later." Readers. Inside was a scrap of tracing paper showing the outline of the convent floor plan with one section shaded darker, the crypt, and a single handwritten sentence. Still there. The pier continued operating without incident through the late 80s, but periodic electrical failures plagued the same sector. Technicians replaced cables, transformers, even the entire junction box. Each fix lasted exactly 1 month. A maintenance supervisor finally marked the area on the schematic with red pencil and the note, "Service irregular, leave be." Dock workers adapted. Some left offerings, coins, matchbooks, rosaries, on a rusted girder near the old boundary. None were stolen. When asked why, a longshoreman named Patrick Doyle answered simply, "Respect." He refused to explain further, but one night he told a visiting reporter, "It's not about ghosts. It's about memory that hasn't finished breathing." The reporter laughed. Yet on playback his recorder carried faint background noise, a steady, low hum, rising and falling like a tide pulling through stone. By the early 1990s, few at the dock spoke openly about the Sisters' Watch, yet a sense of wary respect lingered. Younger workers laughed off the stories until their first night shift when the sea fog rolled in thick, and the pier lights flickered one by one in rhythmic succession. The Harbour Authority logged multiple equipment malfunctions without clear cause, writing it off as moisture interference. But those who worked beneath the cranes noticed a subtle pulse in the concrete, like a slow, distant heartbeat when all engines stopped. In 1993, a graduate researcher from Boston College named Michael Caro began studying folklore tied to urban redevelopment. He visited Pier Street after finding Evelyn Carter's "Still There" note in the archives. Caro interviewed longshoremen and compiled oral accounts for his thesis, Structures of Reverence, Sacred Memory in Secular Cities. One transcript contains an older worker's remark, "You cover a grave with concrete, you still got a grave." Caro also found references to a sealed vault recorded by Dr. Klein decades earlier. His request to open a small exploratory trench was denied for safety. Within a month, Caro abandoned his research, citing disturbances during fieldwork. He left Boston soon after. That same year, an intense storm hit Dorchester Bay. Several storage containers were blown from their moorings, crashing through the old section of the pier. The damage revealed part of the original stone foundation. Among the rubble, workers found what appeared to be a rusted lantern handle engraved with a faint E. It was handed to a site supervisor, who locked it in a maintenance shed. 2 nights later, the shed burned from within. No accelerants were found, only melted glass fused into the concrete floor. The incident never reached the newspapers, but rumors spread quickly among dock workers. Some swore the smell of incense returned with the smoke. Others claimed the fire alarm's bell rang in perfect even intervals, not like a malfunction, but like a call. Parish officials quietly performed a blessing at the pier the following week, though the Harbour Authority listed it as public safety outreach. As redevelopment advanced through the decade, Pier Street's remaining historical fragments were erased. Yet late in 1999, a new warehouse camera captured what investigators later dismissed as light reflection, a tall, veiled figure standing where the boundary of the convent once lay. In the recording, the figure appears only for 4 frames, motionless facing the sea. The security log notes simply "static anomaly." But within the archive, that footage remains restricted, unmarked except for a single handwritten tag in fading ink. Brigid. The dawn of the new millennium brought technology to the harbour, digital sensors, security systems and automated cranes, but even in this modern framework, Pier Street retained its quiet strangeness. Engineers complained that electronic compasses faltered near one particular segment of the terminal, drifting several degrees off true north. Technicians recalibrated, blamed interference from ship hulls and moved on. Still, the irregularity never vanished. In 2003, the city's Digital Records project began scanning historical maps for online archives. One intern reviewing old diocesan layouts overlaid the 1890s convent plans with the current pier grid. The shaded coordinates aligned almost perfectly with the malfunctioning sensor zone. When she mentioned this coincidence to her supervisor, he smiled and told her to write "interesting anomaly" in the metadata and leave it at that. She did, though privately she added a note for herself, "Check Ursuline files, similar magnetic drift." Around that time, a night vision camera installed near the seawall captured brief luminous fluctuations, low-light signatures like moving lanterns. Harbour police dismissed it as fog reflection. But one analyst reviewing the data noticed the pulses occurred precisely every 7 days, each at 12:03 a.m., the same moment the dock lights flickered decades earlier. The report's conclusion: system timing error, non-actionable. That same year, a Jesuit archivist, Father Colin Mercer, wrote a paper on residual sanctity in deconsecrated grounds. He referenced the old Ursuline riot site and St. Brigid's as echo chambers of unresolved faith. His quiet phrasing reignited academic curiosity. Students began visiting the harbour at night to record ambient sound, hoping to document the rumoured hum beneath the concrete. Most heard nothing but the tide, until one recording surfaced, capturing a faint rhythmic undertone resembling a single bell stroke, repeated once every 30 seconds for 2 full minutes. The file was analysed, deemed inconclusive and forgotten. Meanwhile, dock workers noticed birds, mostly gulls and terns, avoiding that portion of the pier. "They don't land there," one said. "They circle, then leave, like the air pushes them off." Environmental specialists found no toxins or magnetic fields strong enough to deter them. A supervisor finally scrawled in the site log, "Area clear, let it be." By the end of 2009, urban developers proposed replacing Pier Street Terminal entirely with condominiums. Before construction could start, a geological survey drilled core samples and discovered void pockets 6 meters below surface, hollow spaces in otherwise solid fill. The report classified them as subsidence artifacts. Yet the foreman told a reporter off record the drill hit something hard that rang like metal under stone. He refused further interviews. Today, the Blueprint Archive lists that sector as closed substratum. No maintenance crew volunteers for night duty there, and even during daylight the air feels colder by a few degrees. Mariners say it's just the wind off the bay, but locals, when pressed, still refer to that corner as the Sisters' Ground, where prayer, stone and time folded together and decided never to let go. By 2010, Pier Street had entered yet another phase of transformation. The shipping industry shrank, giving way to sleek offices and glass towers overlooking the bay. Construction crews dismantled cranes, poured new foundations, and laid fiber cables through what was once St. Bridget's soil. Yet oddly, none of the digital systems installed there operated without intermittent faults. Internet routers blinked off at random intervals, and motion sensors triggered in empty rooms. The building contractors blamed salt air, but the technicians noticed a pattern. The blackouts always occurred between midnight and 12:10, the same minute noted a century earlier by engineers and night guards. During one inspection, a structural analyst named Rachel Lynn recorded an unexplained echo in the service tunnel. It repeated my voice one syllable late, as if the air had memory. Her audio file captured a faint, delayed murmur following her words, resembling a whispered prayer. She dismissed it at first, but the tape later vanished from the site archives. Months afterward, she mailed her supervisor a short letter that ended with the line, "The foundation breathes." No reply survives. In 2013, a local heritage filmmaker named Jonah Reeve began producing a short documentary, The Resurrected Ground, drawing parallels between Boston's forgotten convents and the unrest that had shadowed them since the Ursuline convent riots. Interviewing dock workers, he found most willing to speak only off camera. One, retired foreman Patrick Doyle, the same man who decades earlier had called it memory that hasn't finished breathing, told Reeve, "It's not a haunting, it's a rhythm." That place keeps time for something else. Reeve filmed at the harbor after hours. His final day of shooting captured footage of fog drifting low across the lot. The camera microphone registered a steady metallic hum. When he replayed the video, the hum pulsed in threes like a measured breath. The next morning, Reeve filed his footage for editing but never released the documentary. In interviews years later, he claimed, "I couldn't finish it because the ending never stopped." Urban planners eventually converted the last warehouse into a cultural workspace. The architect preserved a section of original stone under glass in the lobby, labeled simply "recovered masonry." Say 1890. Visitors remarked that the glass fogs over briefly when the tide recedes, then clears again without touch. Staff call it the breathing wall. Every few years, maintenance crews reseal the concrete cracks that appear near the sea-facing edge, yet none stay fixed. The fissures trace a pattern faintly resembling a cross. Engineers attribute it to shifting temperature and pressure, but those who know the site's history find the alignment unsettling. On clear nights, when the water is still and the city quiet, locals claim you can stand on that glass panel and hear one soft bell from nowhere in particular, followed by the hush of unseen waves moving beneath stone. By 2017, Pier Street's transformation was complete, a modern waterfront district with restaurants, offices and quiet walkways where tourists gathered for photographs against the skyline. Only a few of the original dock workers remained, now custodians or caretakers for the new developments. They kept the stories to themselves, shared only when a stranger lingered too long near the eastern seawall. One custodian, Michael Ramos, told a visitor from Providence, "If you stand here at midnight, you'll hear Boston remembering." The visitor laughed until the pavement trembled faintly beneath them, like a sigh pulled from deep water. Developers promoted the district as a symbol of renewal, but small oddities persisted. Security footage often showed brief static at 12:03 a.m., the same timestamp recurring through decades of records. Elevator sensors triggered movement when empty. Once, during a spring storm, All the building alarms in the block rang together in a slow, even rhythm. 5 tones, pause, then 5 again, mimicking the pattern noted in the 1961 report about bell rope burns. Technicians found no mechanical cause. That summer, a young historian named Alice Markham published a paper revisiting forgotten convent archives. She had found correspondence from 1899, letters, between Mother Ignatia and the Boston Archdiocese referring cryptically to the sister restored but not at rest, Markham cross-referenced, the language with contemporary reports of the Ursuline aftermath, suggesting both sites shared a theology of unease, where sanctity blurred into confinement. When she presented her findings at a university conference, a priest from Dorchester quietly approached her afterward. He told her he had seen one of those letters himself decades earlier, sealed behind glass at the diocesan office, then removed without explanation. Markham visited Pier Street to film a short addendum for her research blog. Standing on the waterfront, she described how Boston built layers of silence over its own foundations. Behind her, the camera microphone picked up a faint resonance. 3 slow strikes like a distant bell or metal contacting stone. The sound faded as quickly as it appeared. When she reviewed the footage later, she noticed a brief distortion of light passing behind her shoulder, tall and thin, then gone. She mentioned it once in an interview, calling it a trick of mist and reflection, but never released the full clip. Residents nearby sometimes report the same low vibration after midnight. They describe it not as frightening, but as a heartbeat through the floor. Maintenance teams continue to patch the pier where micro cracks form in the same cruciform pattern each winter. Despite monitoring, no seismic activity is ever recorded. City engineers have a simple note on the inspection form: stable within acceptable limits. And still, those who pause there in quiet moments swear the air grows colder, smelling faintly of wax and salt. A single word often rises unbidden in their thoughts: Eohiba, soft as breath. Quickly gone, leaving behind only the rhythm of water beneath stone. Today, more than a century after Sister Eohiba first walked through the gates of St. Brigid's, the harbour bears no trace of her convent. The pier's restaurants gleam with glass and steel. Music spills from their patios at dusk, yet the ground beneath remains uneven, the air faintly damp even on clear days. Maintenance engineers still log minor settling near the eastern edge each spring, though no structural cause has ever been identified. At night, the glow from street lamps sometimes dims in slow intervals, as if responding to a rhythm older than electricity itself. A few local historians continue to revisit the case, combing parish files and civic archives that survived floods, fires, and neglect. One researcher discovered that early maps of Dorchester Bay list a narrow sub-channel beneath the pier labeled simply Vault, sealed. The annotation vanishes in later revisions. When asked, the city's Heritage Department calls it a clerical error copied forward. But the coordinates match precisely where the soil tests still show hollow resonance. Those who read the report privately admit the measurements ring like struck metal. In 2022, a cultural foundation mounted a small exhibit called Forgotten Faiths of Boston. Among the items was a fragment of carved limestone, believed to have come from the convent wall, the same one kept by Stefan Nowak's family generations earlier. Visitors noted that the glass case fogged slightly each hour, leaving a faint imprint of a cross before clearing. The curator dismissed it as humidity from the bay air, though one attendant swore it happened only when the clock struck 12. At the exhibit's close, an elderly priest offered a brief benediction. In his remarks, he cited the Ursuline convent riots as Boston's oldest wound, and St. Brigid's as its quietest. The first burned in fire, he said softly. The second endures in breath. His words echoed through the gallery's high ceiling, where the faint hum of ventilation carried like distant chanting. Several attendees later said they felt the floor vibrate beneath their feet. Just once a pulse, then stillness. No official account acknowledges Sister Eohiba's death. Her name appears in no cemetery, no diocesan roll, only in marginalia and rumour. Yet among dockworkers, historians and night wanderers, her presence endures as a steady whisper through the harbour fog. Some call it superstition, others faith unburied. Whatever remains there, stone, silence or prayer, belongs wholly to the city now, folded into its rhythm of tide and steel. And if you ever find yourself walking Pier Street long after midnight, pause by the railing where the water breathes against the concrete. Listen closely. Beneath the wind, beneath the hum of passing ships, you may hear one muted bell and the faintest echo of a voice at prayer. It ends where it began, in Boston, still waiting, still unforgotten,